Hello, my name is David Malone. I'm the rector of the UN University, which is basically the president of the UN University. We're headquartered in Tokyo, and we have with us tonight, unusually, two guests rather than one for a public conversation, and an earlier conversation with a mix of our fellows and colleagues and students. And our topic has been the political situation in Nepal, both domestically and its international ramifications. And we'll touch on both in our brief conversation online to give you a sense of some of the things that go on here at UNU. So we have with us Aditya Adhikari, who is with us from Kathmandu. Both of our guests are journalists. Aditya was, until a few years ago, the opinion page editor of the Kathmandu Post. He also consults to the UN every now and then, but in Kathmandu, he's a very well-known figure. And recently, he produced this book, The Bulletin, the Ballot Box, which has been very well reviewed, not just in South Asia, but also internationally, which deals with the involvement of the Maoists in first insurgency and then political life in Nepal, and perhaps where he thinks that might be leading. Prashant Jha, who made his name in Nepal as a journalist, and quite a name he made for himself, wrote this book, Battles of the New Republic, because Nepal was a monarchy until not so long ago, which styles itself contemporary history, which is a modest way of describing its sweep, in fact. He covers a lot of the same ground as Aditya, but in completely different ways. This book also has been very well reviewed in South Asia and also internationally. Aditya and Prashant have been very good friends for a long time, and they're also friends of several of ours at UNU. So we thought it'd be fun to bring them together to Tokyo to have an exchange with the public here this evening. So I think I'll start by asking you, in a very compressed form, why should anybody internationally be interested in Nepali politics?
Nepal, it's in the international view, as you said often, is a peripheral, very small country. But what is often not realized is that Nepal has been the site of very dramatic political changes, and the politics there is very modern. I mean, it's very influenced by contemporary political currents across the world, especially since 1990, where, as a result of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the popular movements in Eastern Europe, we had a popular uprising of our own, which led to the establishment of a multi-party democracy with a constitutional monarchy. But additionally, I mean, since 1990, many countries in the world have had a democratic system. But in Nepal, things get more interesting and complicated by the fact that 6 years after the establishment of a democracy, a Maoist armed movement began in Nepal's countryside. They were very small. They were just about 50 people with 2 guns, perhaps. And no one thought they would get very far, because everyone thought that the Maoist ideology was dead, that even the major communist parties in Nepal had adopted liberal
And China
democracy.
wasn't at all keen on them, as I recall.
No, not at all. The Chinese, until up to 2006, hated the fact that the Nepali Maoists called themselves after the great Chairman Mao. In the Chinese media, in fact, the Nepali Maoists were always referred to as the Nepali rebels. The word Mao was never mentioned up until 2006. But as I was saying, when they started, everyone expected that they would be crushed by the state very quickly, within a month or a few months. But the movement expanded, and after 10 years, They participated in a popular movement which overthrew the monarchy, and they came into the mainstream political process, and they won elections to a constituent assembly in 2008. So this is, in the post-Cold War era, and this is the first major success for a communist group. And I think it's very interesting, and it could be interesting for an audience to see how that became possible. Yeah.
Now, Prashant, what would your take be on that question?
I would add to what Aditya has just said. I mean, I think one of the things that's often forgotten or not known about Nepal is that it's a mid-sized country. It's not really a small country. It is the 40th largest country in the world with a population of 30 million. It is also very strategically located. It is in the middle of the two Asian giants, India and China. So the geography and the size of the country also lends it some importance. But to go back to the politics of the place, I will take off from where Aditya left, which is that not only did the Maoists succeed in becoming the first radical left insurgent group in the post-1990 era to access state power in some way, they also led along with other democratic political parties, a fundamental change in Nepal. Nepal moved from being a monarchy to a republic. It moved from being in the middle of a war to peace. It moved from being a Hindu state to a secular state. And it moved from being a unitary state controlled by a very tiny section of the population to a potentially federal system. And all of this is happening through a democratically elected constituent assembly. So I think it's a remarkable example of a country coming together to draft its social contract in a democratic manner, and that becoming a tool to institutionalize peace. So I think it does hold lessons for other conflicts, for other societies grappling with diversity, and for countries which are also dealing with a difficult, sometimes enabling, sometimes not so enabling external environment and external actors.
Well, it demonstrates, amongst other things, that there are worse things than having politicians shouting at each other in Parliament, because what came before the current stage was definitely a lot worse. Now, a bit earlier today, Aditya, you were discussing with some of us the fact that the UN got involved in this complex situation about 10 years ago, I suppose, perhaps a bit earlier. Could you tell us in a telescoped way about that?
Well, the UN involvement in Nepal's peace process was quite substantial. They didn't have much power on their own, in the sense that they didn't have any executive responsibility or mandate to implement anything. But they've been a part of Nepal's peace process from the very beginning. Since 2003, DPA officials were involved in trying to mediate an end to the conflict. They were in touch with high-level Maoist leaders and high-level people in the government and parliamentary parties. And in 2005, OHCHR, the the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, established an office in Nepal to investigate, to document atrocities or human rights violations committed by both sides of the conflict, but at that time primarily focusing on the regime, because at that time there was a military regime led by the king. Later, the UNMIN, the UN political mission, was established, and they played a crucial role in negotiating an arms agreement and overseeing the monitoring of the two armies. And they helped, for a certain period, they played a role in helping build trust between the former rebels, the Maoists, and the parliamentary parties. And and to this day, the UN still is very, very deeply involved in what remains of Nepal's political transition, including the transitional justice aspect. There are many, the UN role has evolved in many ways. Sometimes the relations with the government and the parties are very close and friendly. Sometimes they're antagonistic. But I can say that they've been a partner for a long time and will probably remain for some time to come.
Great. And Prashant, we were also talking earlier, and you mentioned it in your remarks just now, the fact that Nepal is sandwiched between the two giants of Asia, both of them rising powers, and its international relations are in fact quite complex and influence indirectly, perhaps, the political game in Kathmandu. So what do you think would be the dominant features of international involvement?
I think the central geopolitical fact for Nepal has been for 2 centuries and remains the dominance of earlier British India and now India in Nepal's internal affairs. I've always argued that the India-Nepal relationship cannot be understood if we view it through the prism of just a normal state-to-state relationship. It is deeply, it has historical links. There are the very close family, cultural, linguistic kinship ties between the two countries. At the level of the state, Nepal is enormously dependent on India for various things, from essential commodities like fuel and salt, which come from India, to a lot of to the economic relationship. Nepal's political movements have been influenced by Indian political movements, and the Indian establishment has a great deal of leverage with Nepali political actors. All of this has meant that in the current political process, India played an enormously important, and I would argue constructive role, and I see it as the success of India's regional diplomacy, one of its big successes in bringing peace in Nepal. It facilitated the agreement between the Maoists and the political parties. And at other points, India's role has perhaps not been as constructive when it has got too enmeshed in domestic political battles, where one side or the other side has invited India to back their position in that domestic landscape. Having said that, Nepal is also China's neighbor, and we have a long border with China precisely in the region where China is relatively or feels somewhat insecure, which is Tibet. Nepal is home to Tibetan refugees, and China's concern in Nepal is primarily stems from the presence of these Tibetan refugees, and it would like a Nepali government, a friendly Nepali government, which cracks down on any sign of Tibetan descent. And while that is a key element and key objective of China's engagement in Nepal, what we have seen in the past decade is growing Chinese engagement in a host of sectors. There are more Chinese tourists coming, there's more Chinese investment coming in infrastructure, in the hospitality sector, and there are many Nepali students who have traditionally gone to India and to the West in the past few decades. Many Nepali students who are now going to China to pursue higher education. So the kind of links that we now have with China will translate into some kind of political impact a few years or decades down the line. How that will play out is to be seen. I'll just add one more point, which is that the India-China relationship in Nepal, like the India-China relationship generally, is cooperative at times. They work together to push outcomes like a stable Nepal but at some points it's competitive. But what we do not have yet, and I hope Nepal does not become the site for this, is a relationship where India and China are backing completely different political groupings within Nepal, and that battle will not be good for Nepal, and fortunately that's not the case right now.
Terrific. And I should have mentioned that Prashant moved about 4 years ago from Kathmandu to Delhi, where he worked first at the great newspaper of South India, but also influential all over the country, The Hindu. And today he works for the major English language newspaper in New Delhi, the Hindustan Times. Now, before we conclude, I want to ask each of you what aspect of your book you most enjoyed exploring.
For me, I was a journalist before I wrote the book, and I was following the high politics for a very long period, for quite a few years, and I was writing about it. But in my book, I wanted to give my book a very a slight literary touch, or a more historical kind of. I wanted to bring the experiences of the people who are involved in the Nepal Civil War to life. And as a result, I started reading a lot of material that was produced by Nepali Maoists. Not the top people, because the top people, they write in a very they're writing policy kind of documents, or it's very jargon-ridden or ideological. But the middle-ranking people or the low-ranking people, they were writing in their diaries, they were writing letters to each other, they were writing poems. Later, many of them wrote memoirs, which they got published. So I found in this a trove of really great material to bring the human dimension of the war to life. And I use a lot of it in my book. And for me, that is probably the most satisfying part of the book.
Terrific. And you were very successful in doing this. And Prashant, what about yours?
There were two elements of the book that I particularly enjoyed writing. One, Nepal is a very diverse country. And the usual narrative that we have of Nepal is that of a Himalayan state. But Nepal is also home to people of the plains. And there is a lot of political turbulence in the plains where people who live there have felt excluded from the state structure. And I come from that region. And the battle there is not just for political representation, but for identity and dignity. And the thrust of that movement is that, look, I can be culturally distinct from a hill Nepali, but I'm as much of a Nepali citizen. And through my personal experiences and through testimonies of people who have lived there and through lots of travel-based reportage from that region, I have tried to, in the book, bring out the identity angst of and the dilemmas of people who live in that region. So that's relatively undocumented, I would suggest. And the other element that I particularly enjoyed doing was writing about Kathmandu's high politics. We have always written of Kathmandu high politics in analytical terms, but because I was a reporter and I was privileged enough to have access to some of these top leaders, I was able to I think document to some extent their dilemmas, how decisions were taken, the backroom negotiations, the deals that were struck in the middle of the night only to be broken the next morning, and the role of Indian diplomats and Indian intelligence agents. So Kathmandu's high politics is an element of that book, but hopefully done in a slightly different manner.
Well, in conclusion, just an appreciation from me, because I read both books. Many journalists wind up writing books, not always very successfully. These two have done exactly what you described, Aditya. You reached beyond journalism towards literature, and you both succeeded. I don't know how you did it, because most of us who are day-to-day writers fail when we try to make that transition. So congratulations to you both. I can recommend both books very strongly to anybody interested in rapid political change, anybody interested in South Asia, because the Nepal experience is quite important. Anybody interested in China also will find these two books important, because it shows a China that actually has been very restrained in Nepal for a variety of reasons that you both explore. China has not been the rampaging China that some seem to fear at all. Indeed, very often it has deferred to India and India's preferences in Nepal, the side of China we simply don't see in international relations very much. Thank you for joining us online. We'll look forward to having you with us again in the future. And above all, thank you to my two guests.
Thank you very much.